Welcome to Ray's Reflection, the Common Man's Bible Study. Today we are going to start Paul's trip to Rome. It begins with being seized in Jerusalem and a crowd wanting to have him killed, etc. And the things he does to maneuver the situation, the things he does to give the gospel. This is what Paul has been warned about. Now, he is not surprised at what is going to happen. He doesn't know exactly what's going to happen, but he's not surprised that the people are going to be very antagonistic towards him, because as he traveled towards Jerusalem, he has been warned from town to town to town by prophets that he would be seized and he would be bound in Jerusalem. So what is going to happen and befall him in Jerusalem is not something surprising to him. The only thing he has to worry about is the specs of the thing. In other words, what are the details? They're not. He doesn't know them, but he knows he's in trouble. Now you have to remember from last lesson that he has just gone into the temple with 7 men who have taken Nazirite vow, and he participated in their vow by supporting them, by going in with them, by praying with them, and so on. And that was done by the urging of the elders at the church in Jerusalem to show the people that he was not opposed to Jewish custom. And this is a difficult part. This is the most difficult part. Most races throughout the world, we can separate their religion from their customs. We can separate their religion from their tradition. But when we deal with the Jews, their religion oftentimes is their religion is their customs. It is who they are, and therefore sometimes it's very difficult to separate them. But Paul, knowing this, participated in this Nazirite vow with these 7 men. Now, in order to complete this, was the men would take their hair and they would burn them in the temple. Now, after this was over, Paul is coming out of the temple with these men. And we begin in verse 27 of chapter 21. And we may go right into chapter 22. I'm not sure here how far we'll get. Verse 27 says, "And when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews who were of Asia..." Now, you have to remember, this is the Feast of Pentecost. Paul has traveled and has wanted to get to Jerusalem for this particular feast. But he's not the only Jew who's been traveling to these feasts. Jews come from all over the Mediterranean to feast in Jerusalem, to celebrate the feast in Jerusalem. So you have some Jews who have traveled from Asia. We suspect that they probably traveled somewhere around Ephesus, somewhere in that area. And they have seen the protest and the opposition opposed to Paul. And it almost appears as if this might be their second chance, so to speak, to get him. They are Jews that are antagonistic to the gospel. He says, "When they saw him in the temple, they stirred up all the people and laid hands on him." Now, crying out, "Men of Israel, help." In other words, they grabbed the hold of Paul and they hollered out to everyone, "Help! This is the man that teaches." Now I'm going to read this, and I will list them, and I will list them as I explain them. It says, "This is the man that teaches all men everywhere against the people and the law and this place, and further brought Greeks also into the temple, and has polluted this holy place." And it says here, "For they had seen before with him in the city Trophimus, an Ephesian, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple." Now, boy, I stumbled all over that one, didn't I? Now, what you're looking at here is you're looking at lies. And the lies are perpetrated by a misunderstanding. Now, throughout the Gospel of John, when you study the Gospel of John, you begin with darkness not being able to overcome light. And we understand that men are born in darkness, and they remain in darkness their entire life until the Holy Spirit comes in and opens their eyes and helps them to understand the light. And the light can be something from God, and the light himself is God, is Jesus Christ. But we are also light. In other words, we are expounders of truth, and therefore we're going to have people who cannot understand what we're saying. And it isn't a matter of not wanting to understand. It's a matter of looking at the spiritual teaching and misinterpreting it. And therefore, you get this wrong concept, and that's why these men are yelling these things. Now, there is some deception, there is some evil in what they're saying, because obviously what they're saying are lies. But you have to understand that they apparently are quite sincere. If I'm talking to any teachers out there, you know what I'm talking about. You say something in a classroom, guaranteed, when it gets home, it's not the same as what you said in the classroom. And here's the amazing thing that people don't understand. Is the child lying? And the answer is, well, yes, he is. Does he believe he's lying? The answer is no. He believes this is what the teacher said. And therefore, this is the problem with men in darkness. They hear the truth, they hear light, and they misinterpret it. They infer, they misinterpret, all kinds of things. And if you ask them, is this what was said? They say, yes, that's exactly what was said. They believe what they are saying is true, and they are lies. So these are literally all lies, but whether these men know all of this, we will begin to see some of the things they did were downright evil and downright wrong. So the first one we come to is they accuse Paul of being anti-Jewish. Now, let's understand something. Paul just showed them that he is pro-Jewish. But you have to understand how they come up with this. First of all, let us understand what it means to a Jew to become a follower of Christ. When he does that, and especially in the first century, when he does that, he turns his back on everything that is Jewish. He is no longer allowed in the temple. He's no longer allowed in the marketplaces. He's no longer allowed into society. He is anti-Jew. In other words, in their minds, he is not even Jewish. It's almost like he becomes an un-Jew. And in today's world, and I'm sure it was back then, I can't say definitely, but they are considered to have died. In other words, the remaining family considers them as though they're dead. And therefore, Paul is being accused here of being anti-Jew. In other words, Paul, you left the temple area, you left the Jewish race and accepted Jesus Christ as your Messiah. You turned your back on the Jews. Therefore, everything you say is anti-Jew. So they accused Paul of being anti-Jew, and he just fulfilled a Nazirite vow with these 7 men to show that he was not against their customs. He was not against the Jew. But this is what they said. The second thing they said was that he was anti-law. In other words, he was telling Gentiles, etc., and Jew that they no longer had to follow the law. Now, what he's talking about is, he's talking about the laws of Moses. Now, Paul just went through the ceremonial, or a ceremonial aspect, and the law was not, this ceremonial law was not necessarily given by Moses. But he's not against the law, but they accuse him of being anti-law. What he is against the law for salvation purposes. And in other words, he's against keeping of the law in order to be saved or to be right with God. This is what he's against. And therefore, he's actually using the law to show that Jesus Christ is the Messiah. And they are totally opposed to this, so they say, you are against the law, which would be, you are against Moses. Now notice these accusations pretty much follow the same accusation that Stephen received. Now they accuse him of speaking against the temple. Now when they speak against the temple, he's telling them that sacrifices are no longer needed. Jesus Christ has come and has given the final and ultimate sacrifice, and therefore there's no more need for sacrifices for the atoning of sins and for the purpose of salvation. Jesus Christ was that sacrifice. Therefore, they're saying, you're teaching against the temple. That would be teaching against God, or in their mind, the concept of God. And the last thing he's accused of is he's accused of bringing Gentiles into the temple. This is a lie. Now, the reason it is because it's made up. And it's made up because as Paul was traveling throughout the city, he had Trophimus with him. And Trophimus was from Ephesus. Now, Ephesus, you remember the big to-do in Ephesus where they brought him into an amphitheater sort of thing and put him on trial. And therefore, and the Romans didn't see a whole lot of problem with what Paul was doing. All he saw was this was an inside fighting, etc. You claiming one thing and Paul is claiming another. In other words, you Jews are waiting for your Messiah to arrive, and Paul is telling you he has arrived. And that's to the Romans that was no big deal, and therefore Paul got away with it. But now these people were obviously from the area of Ephesus, and now they saw Paul walking in the city with Trophimus, and therefore they naturally assumed. Now no, it was an assumption. They didn't see him. They assumed that Paul brought a Gentile into the temple and therefore desecrated the temple. And Paul did not do that. And they were, obviously, these avid Jews were very, very angry. And it says, all the city was moved, and the people ran together, and they took Paul, and they threw him out of the temple. And at once the doors were shut. In other words, they shut the doors to the temple. And when they say they threw him out of the temple, they didn't throw him out of the temple area, because there's still the court of the Gentiles in which they were at. But he's talking about the temple proper, the area where only the Jews were allowed. You know, if you looked at the temple, you walk in, you have the court of the Gentiles where Gentiles could go, etc., to worship Jehovah. And then you go up through another gate. That was for the Jews only, and the women's area. And then you go further, and that was for the Jewish men, etc. And then obviously you have the holies of holies. But so when they threw him out of the temple, they threw him out of the temple proper, so that he's now probably, most likely, in the court of the Gentiles. Now, and as they went about let me back up here. See, it says this here. And as they went about to kill him, in other words, they were beating up on him pretty good, tidings came unto the chief captain of the band, and all of Jerusalem was in an uproar. Now the chief captain of the bands would be the bands of Roman soldiers. And there was a tower or a barracks next to the temple area, and they had a set of stairs that went from the barracks down into the court of the Gentiles, so that if something occurred, they could get down there very quickly, because remember, they're Gentiles, so they can get into that area, and therefore they could go down into that area quickly and settle a problem. The amount of soldiers there was under this particular man, there were 1,000. There were 1,000 soldiers, so he was head of quite a large number. And who immediately, he said, took soldiers and centurions. Now a centurion would be, notice it's plural, centurions. Centurion would be a man who's a head of 100 men, and he took, we don't know how many of those, but he took more than one, so we're talking at least 200 men, 200 soldiers, at least, at the very least. And he took centurions with them and ran down onto them. And when they saw the chief captain and the soldiers, they ceased beating Paul. In other words, when they saw the soldiers coming, etc., hey, they stopped beating. Pretty much like a riot with the police coming, you see. Then the chief captain came near and took him, and commanded him to be bound. In other words, they took Paul and they bound him with 2 chains, and demanded who he was and what he had done. In other words, before they were going to make a move, etc., they wanted to know what was going on. What did Paul do to deserve this beating? And some cried one thing, and some another among the multitudes. And in other words, the crowd was just yelling accusations, and they were yelling accusations from all sides, so that this man who's a head of 1,000 soldiers, he couldn't determine who was telling the truth and who wasn't, and he couldn't even determine what the situation was. And when he could not know the certainty for the tumult, he commanded him to be carried into the barracks. So they went back, they took Paul in chains and brought him back up the stairs, etc. And they were going to take him into the barracks. And when he came upon the stairs, so it was that he was borne of the soldiers because of the violence of the people. For the multitude of the people, now this is verse 36, for the multitude of the people followed after, crying, away with him. In other words, pretty much like, crucify him. And as Paul was to be led into the barracks, he said to the chief captain, may I speak unto you? Who said, can I speak Greek? In other words, the chief captain, etc., Paul looked at him and says, can I say something to you? And the guy was kind of shocked. He was kind of shocked that Paul could speak Greek, because he was speaking in the centurion's language. And so he says, so the centurion was, this captain rather, was rather surprised, and he said, art not thou the Egyptian who before these days made us an uproar and led us out into the wilderness 4,000 men that were murderers? Now, what this Roman soldier is dealing with is he's talking about a man in 54 AD, an Egyptian, who led 4,000 men, literally 4,000 assassins, and created an uproar. And they were chased into the desert, where 500 to 600 of them were killed. And the others just simply assimilated themselves into the Jewish population. But they weren't through. They were assassins. So therefore, what they would wait for is they would wait for feast days when the city of Jerusalem was very crowded, etc. And they would go about assassinating people who were pro-Roman and so on. And they were like zealots. And therefore, they were still around. And therefore, the Roman soldiers were very aware that these assassins were in the crowd to kill somebody. And so therefore he's saying to them, aren't you that man who led them, created this uproar? In other words, he confused Paul with that man, but he was very surprised that Paul could speak Greek, because obviously that man could not. But Paul said, I am a man who is a Jew of Tarsus. In other words, I'm a Jew, and I'm from the city of Tarsus. And he says, a city of Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city. In other words, Tarsus was probably in the entire Mediterranean area. There was Rome, there was Alexandria, and probably the next two cities would probably be Athens and Tarsus. In other words, on that level. In other words, it was not a small city. It was a big, powerful city. And because he was from the city of Tarsus, etc., it is quite apparent that Paul was very capable of speaking Greek. And the other thing that the man should have, but did not pick it up, was the fact that Paul is a Roman citizen here. So you have to be careful how you handle him. And he said, and I beg you, he says, I beseech thee, permit me to speak unto the people. Let me speak to the people. And when he had given him permission, Paul stood on the stairs and beckoned with a hand unto all the people. And when there was a great silence, he spoke unto them in the Hebrew tongue, saying, and what he's speaking to them here is probably a slang of Arabic. In other words, this is what the people use. You know, you say, well, the Jews were speaking Hebrew, not all the Jews. Arabic was the language of the day. Jesus spoke in Arabic. So therefore Paul here spoke to them in their tongue. And you might indicate that he spoke in the Hebrew tongue, therefore he spoke Hebrew. Well, Hebrew was Aramaic. And in chapter 22 it says this, "Men, brethren, and fathers, hear ye my defense, which I make unto you." Now notice how he starts off. He says, "Men, brethren, and fathers." He makes a connection. When you're looking at Paul, we're going to start this defense of Paul, and it's going to take most of the next chapter, complete next chapter, and Paul is going to give literally his testimony of what has happened to him. We have to look at this as to why he did it this way. And I think you're dealing with the way in which he did it and what he did, etc., is extremely important and is valid today. He is talking to an antagonistic crowd. He is talking to a crowd that wants him dead. Not only do they want him dead, but they just tried to kill him. Now, in order to talk to a crowd like that, in order to talk to a crowd that's totally antagonistic, then you must find common ground. And therefore you must find a connection with them. And the first connection he has is tremendous respect for men, the Jewish men, brethren. He calls them brethren because he too is a Jew, and fathers, and he recognizes the leaders. He recognizes, he's not talking here the fathers as a person who's the father of a family. He's talking about the fathers or the elders of the Jewish religion, and fathers. And he recognizes it. In other words, he's telling them he's not opposed to the Jews. He's not opposed to the Jewish custom. And he says this, "Hear ye my defense." And that is my apology. And that is where we get the word apologetics. A defense of the gospel. And he's going to make this. And what he's trying to do here is the first thing, he's trying to do two things. One, he's trying to make a connection with the people. And I think that's valid today. If you are talking to a group of people that are antagonistic to you, then there must be common ground you have with them. There is common ground you have. I'll give you a simple example. I was working one night, my kids were in college, and I was working a second shift after teaching all day. I was painting an office. And there was a security guard who was on duty, and he would walk, and his path would walk right behind where I was working. In other words, my back was to him, and he was about maybe 10 feet away from me. And we would exchange hellos and so on, and he would pass by. And as he would pass by, I would try to get him involved in a conversation about the Lord. And he would roll his eyes, and keep on marching. After 2 or 3 times I did this, etc., I got a little angry. And I told myself, I'm not going to speak to him again. And then the Lord worked on me, and I realized there was no connection between he and I. None. So when he came by, I said, I've got to make a connection. So when he came by, I said, "Hey, this is your second job, isn't it?" He goes, stops, and he says, "Yeah." I said, "You have a mortgage on your house." He said, "Yeah." I said, "You have 2 cars in your driveway. One of them has a car payment." And he's getting inquisitive. "How in the world do I know this?" And he said, and I said, "And furthermore," I looked at his age, I said, "You have a kid in high school who's thinking about going to college, and you don't know how you're going to send him." And he looked at me and says, "Yeah." And then I told him, I have the exact same thing. I have a house with a mortgage. I have 2 cars out front. One has a car payment on it. And I have 2 kids in college. They're already in college. And he says, "How do you do it?" And I said, "Well, let me tell you about the Lord." And he stopped and he listened. And he listened because I had made a connection. This is what Paul is going to do. This is what we're going to study. The connection. He makes a connection early before he gives his entire testimony. Before he gives the gospel, he gives his testimony. And he makes that connection with the Jewish people. And they will listen to him. And if you listen, and a great silence, he says, comes upon them. And in other words, you look at the end of chapter 21, and they quieted down to listen to him. But when he started making this connection, they quieted down even more, so that it was almost dead silent. That is the connection. The second thing you're going to look at, we're going to look at his motives. Why are you doing what you're doing? And I think if you're looking at this from a trial, and he's being tested, he's defending himself, defending not just the gospel, but he's also defending himself and his actions, then you need to have a reason why. Why are you doing this? Why are you doing what you're doing? Why did you turn your back on the Jewish race? Why are you preaching Jesus Christ? And so on. That would be his motives. So if you're going to accuse someone of a crime, or you're going to accuse someone of wrongdoing, I think the first thing you have to establish is his motives. Why did you do what you're doing? And we're going to look at this. So Paul has started in chapter 22, he has started his defense by making a connection with the Jewish people, men and brethren. And from there, we're going to launch into his conversion. Now, we've already studied much of this in chapter 9. And when we go through it, we're going to go through it a little bit quicker than we did in chapter 9, because we're dealing with different things. And we're trying to find things that are useful for today. So, until next time, I bid you Godspeed from on Victory Side. We'll see you next week.